right, so we're going to jump into Genesis chapter 38 tonight, and I actually voiced to you, some of you, my concern with handling this passage. And I actually thought about skipping over it, but then I realized that you need to be preaching the whole counsel of God. So why would you skip over something like this? Because chapter 38, if you think it's been crazy so far with family, 38's really crazy, okay? So did I just lose myself? There we go. I'm back on. All right. So I'll just stay behind the pulpit, even though I'm really uncomfortable with that. All right. So in Genesis chapter 38, when we see this, I was going through it, and I realized, you know what? This is real people. And I thought about the kids, because I've got my own kids out here listening to this message. And I thought, you know what? There's a ton of kids that we interact with on at least a weekly basis. If you're within the school system, on a daily basis, that go through some of these types of situations. And how do we respond to it? How do we love them through it? How do we come to understand some of this living? And even some of you tonight, when you read through this, you say, well, this really isn't that crazy. I've seen this. I've lived this. I've experienced this. And the beauty of a passage like this is that you can come out on the other side understanding that God is still in control. That God still has a beautiful plan. And when you find that God is silent amidst a lot of this, has anybody felt like God's been silent in some of their circumstances? And yet there's scripture there. We just got to go to it. There's truth there that we've got to go to. So as we jump into this passage, it is kind of crazy and crazy lifestyles, but I know that God's got a plan for this tonight. And I've entitled this, "Oh Come All You Unfaithful." And there's a reason behind this. I've been listening to this song, a song that is entitled this. It's actually a Christmas song. Kind of goes, you thought that I misprinted there, "Oh come all you faithful." That's what you were thinking, really. But at the very end, I'm gonna give you the lyrics behind this song. And I think you'll come to understand the reason why I picked this title here tonight as we jump into chapter 38. So as we understand coming into this passage, we see where we've jumped from Joseph and how really Genesis at the very end starts to emphasize Joseph and what happens with him. But then all of a sudden we go from him being sold into slavery to Potiphar, and it introduces that. And then all of a sudden in chapter 38, it's like they've just shoot in another depiction, another story, true story, that they just put right in there. And then you go right into chapter 39, and it goes right back to where we were with Joseph. And you say, well, why is that? And I really think part of the reason is there's so much correlation and connection that you have to understand the difference between Judah and Joseph. Now, Judah was the one that stopped him and said, hey, let's not kill him. Let's try to sell him. We want to make some money off of it. There's no profit in killing him. And then he jumps into this right here. We understand that Judah, where is he in the line of in understanding where Jesus comes in his ancestral line? He's a part of it. He's where the kingly line comes through, and so there's this guy who's selfish and wants to gain from his brother's demise, and Jesus comes from this line. I think this just kind of gives us some understanding. So when you see this tonight, really grasp into what's going on here and understand some of what has happened in the past is actually going to relate to what's going on right now, and we can make some of those connections. So as we jump into this, let's go into the first point here. Judah isolates himself. Okay, Judah isolates himself and befriends the locals. You find this in verse number 1. And it came to pass at that time that Judah went down from his brethren and turned into a certain Adulamite whose name was Hira. Okay, so at this point in his family's history, they've just sold Joseph into slavery. Joseph has been isolated from his family, not because of something that he's desired, but he's been made to be separated from his family, which was actually at the will of Judah, who has initiated this selling of Joseph. And yet, at the same point, Judah has isolated himself on purpose, voluntarily, from his family. And you wonder why Judah would do such a thing. Well, listen, if you've sinned against your father, would you want to hang around him? If you've deceived your father in showing up, knowing that it was your plan to go and sell your brother, the favorite brother, and bring back his coat of many colors, soaked with blood, and say, hey, Dad, we just found this. And let him jump into the story of, well, he must have been killed by a beast. And just letting that go. If I can separate myself from the sin, maybe it will just go away. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever tried to do that? You've committed deception, you've committed sin, and as long as I'll just separate myself from this, maybe I'll just move out of Taylorville and all the problems will go away. Let's just get the answer. If I just try to separate myself physically from the consequences of my sin, do they ever go away? But it's a way that we deceive ourselves. But who's another person that's isolated themselves from the family that God's called to come together and to take this land on, and that God's made this promise to? Who else has isolated themselves from the family? There was just a few chapters ago, we found one of the sisters, Dinah, who's gone and hung out with the locals. And guess what happened to her? There were some consequences to that, and it wasn't all of her fault, but we understand the very fact of the matter that she has separated herself to go and to hang out with the ladies of the land, and then she gets into some serious trouble. But you not only do to understand that, but you can go back several chapters before that, and who is another one who has isolated himself away from the family? Well, you find Lot. How many times did he get in trouble? Well, he got kidnapped by King, was it King Cheddar? Is that what we nicknamed him as, right? Okay, King Cheddar, okay, and all that battle that was going on, and understanding that those kings had taken him away, and Abraham had to go and save him, and then guess what? Next comes along, there's the judgment against Sodom and Gomorrah. Guess what happens to Lot? Oh man, he gets isolated even more. Goes up into the caves with his daughter, and it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse and worse for him. And so we understand that Judah has taken himself away. He's isolated himself away from what's going on in his family to a point where he goes and he starts taking refuge with a friend, the Adulamite, whose name is Hira. This is when the problems start to happen. But not only that, Judah finds a wife amongst the locals. He does something different. And in fact, within their family, you've understood that the family's gone and the father or the mother has gone to choose a certain individual, or has been very active in finding the individual, the spouse, for the children. And yet you come to this point where he goes off on his own and he finds his own spouse amongst the locals. It says, and Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he took her and went in unto her, and she conceived and bare a son, and he called his name What a name. And she conceived again and bare a son and called his name Onan. And she yet again conceived and bare a son and called his name Shelah, and he was at Chesib, which she bare him. And so we find out in this circumstance that not only is he befriending the locals, but he's taking on a wife from the locals. We're understanding that that he is becoming unequally yoked at this point. This is a term that you see within the New Testament where we're commanded to not be unequally yoked. And so when we jump into this situation, you say, well, wait a minute. I'm not even sure if he believes in God at this point. And really, you've got a point there to be made. Does he actually believe in God because he's separated, he's isolated, he's selfish, he's greedy? And yet, so by his fruit, do you actually understand him to be a follower after God and actually have a relationship with God? Is it just superficial? But yet at that point, we do understand that this family has been separated to God, and there is that physical sign there, circumcision, that we understand that they have been separated to God. But yet he's come away from all of that and is joined up with someone who really, he's following after Esau's way of living. And if you remember back to that, Esau, his parents really didn't like what he did. And he tried to cover it up. Try to fix the mistakes that he went for. But you know what? You know what's interesting about us? As we make mistakes in our younger years, and when we have our own children, what do? We decide to become Mr. Fix-It or Mrs. Fix-It. All of a sudden, something changes whenever his kids get old enough to take on a spouse. And he tries to become Mr. Fix-It, but Mr. Fix-It fails. Has anybody tried to become Mr. Fix-It or Mrs. Fix-It for their children? Did it work? Now, we can do and set up everything that we possibly can for them to be able to seek after God, but can we make the horse actually drink the water? And we come in and he says, well, hey, I'm going to set you up. And so first son, we get in here, we find out that he's so wicked that God actually kills him. You see in verse number 6, it says, and Judah took a wife for his firstborn, whose name was Tamar. You've probably heard of this name. Tamar actually comes up. It's another name that comes from David's family. But here, Judah took this wife from his firstborn. His name was Tamar. And Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord slew him. So we find out that God really doesn't say anything. He just acts. And yet Mr. Fix-It comes in and he says, I'm going to set this up. I'm going to provide a wife for you. And yet, the sins of the father tend to be fruitful in the sins of the son. And he was so wicked that God decided to take him from this earth. Now, within this situation, we jump into the second son who is so selfish that God actually kills him. Wow, what a good family tree, right? And we jump into verse number 8, and Judah said unto Onan, go in unto thy brother's wife and marry her and raise up seed to thy brother. Now, if you understand within Genesis, which we're going to see later on, or within Deuteronomy, and you're going to see the type of marriage that God sets up and the law that God sets up, he'll actually set it up to where if a man marries a woman and the man passes away, that woman actually gets passed on to, I know that sounds really bad, but gets passed on to the next available brother. Wow, that would be scary, wouldn't it? But yet the next available brother comes up, and he has a child, and if it's a male, then that male will actually step in as the son of the first brother, the one that passed away, and so it'll actually be like a sub-in for taking on the family. And so when you have that male, then that male would be able to grow up and to be able to take care of his family. And so it was a way that God had set it up to where even though there was a widow, that the widow would be taken care of. And so I think that's a very interesting way of being able to set it up. It's really not into practice the way that we do things here at Grace Baptist Church, okay? Which I'm very thankful for, because if I died, there's no one left for my wife. So I guess she'd be free, all right? So, but as you get into that situation, this is how Judah set it up. And he steps in and he says, listen, I want Tamar to go with Onan, and you're going to to have a child with her, and that seed is going to be raised up for your brother. But you know what? Onan didn't like that. And when he didn't like that, you should jump over to verse number 10. It says, the thing which he did displease the Lord. He didn't want to have a child with her. And God didn't like it. So what did he do? He killed him. Wow, this is such an encouraging message already. He killed him. So, well, there is the third son. But what happens? The third son is too young, so Judah makes a promise he does not intend to keep. So he jumps in here, and in verse number 11, he says, then said Judah to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow at thy father's house. And so at that point, he's actually passed off responsibility back to her father. Instead of taking responsibility in this situation, he's passed her back to the father. He says, till Shelah my son be grown, for he said, lest peradventure he die also, as his brethren did. And Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house. So Judah comes up and says, man, this lady must be a black widow. I got to get her out of my house. I can't have her hanging around my third son until he actually grows up. And then maybe this will happen. But he really didn't intend to keep it, as we'll see later on in this passage. And so she just goes back to her father's house. And there she sits waiting. What a life. How depressing. But you know what? This local, as we jump further into the passage, this local uses Judah's sinful nature to fulfill his promise. You know the same sinful nature that Judah's been showing all throughout here continues on down the line, and yet she's going to use that in order to deceive him, in order to fulfill this promise. And it's ironic how it gets to this point. But let's read through the last portion of this passage. In verse number 12, it says, and in the process of time, the daughter of Shua, Judah's wife, died. And Judah was comforted and went up unto his sheep shearers to Timnah, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. So his wife passes away. He gets past the mourning period, and he goes with his friend that he's been hanging out with from verse number 1, and he's going up and he's taking care of his flocks. Verse 13, it was told Tamar, saying, behold, thy father-in-law goeth up to Timnah to shear his sheep. And she put her widow's garments off of her and covered her with a veil and wrapped herself and sat in an open place, which is by the way to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah was grown, and she was not given unto him to wife. So she understands that, listen, Judah's not going to follow through because Shelah's grown up, and yet she's still stuck there in the widow's garments. She's still in the mourning garments. And Judah's he's not going to fulfill this promise. So she's got to take this into her own hands. And in verse 15, when Judah saw her, he thought her to be an harlot because she had covered her face. And he turned unto her by the way and said, go to, I pray thee, let me come in unto thee. For he knew not that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, what wilt thou give me that thou mayest come in unto me? And he said, I will send thee a kid from the flock. And she said, wilt thou give me a pledge till thou send it? So she wants a surety just in case he doesn't send the kid from the flock. And he said, what pledge shall I give thee? And she said, thy signet and thy bracelets and thy staff that is in thine hand. And he gave it to her and came in unto her, and she conceived by him. And she arose and went away and laid by her veil from her and put on the garments of her widowhood. So after all of this, she goes back, she takes this pledge, she makes sure that he has this pledge to make sure that he would send this kid from the flock. But really, she doesn't care about this because she goes back to put on the garments that she wore, being a widow. And in verse 20, and Judah sent the kid by the hand of his friend, the Adullamite, to receive his pledge from the woman's hand, but he found her not. She wasn't there. He went to go and fulfill the promise, but she wasn't there. Then he asked the men of that place, saying, where is the harlot that was openly by the wayside? And they said, there was no harlot in this place. They have no idea. She really wasn't a norm there. And he returned to Judah and said, I cannot find her. And also the men of the place said that there was no harlot in this place. And Judah said, let her take it to her, lest we be shamed. And behold, I sent this kid, and thou hast not found her. Verse 24, and it came to pass about 3 months after that it was told Judah, saying, Tamar, thy daughter-in-law, hath played the harlot, and also, behold, she is with child by whoredom. And Judah said, bring her forth and let her be burnt. Ouch. Wait a minute. How hypocritical of him. The man whose wife just died, he goes and fulfills his lust of the eyes, his lust of the flesh. And yet he finds out that his daughter-in-law is pregnant, and she was supposedly committing the act of what he went and paid someone to do. And yet he turns around and says she needs to be burned. You say, how dare he? This reminds me of a different king down the line who ended up being described as a man after God's own heart. And that really wasn't because of his sin, but because of the way he responded after he sinned. Remember David and Bathsheba? And after he committed this, and he lied, and he committed murder of one of his mighty men, the prophet comes in and relays to him a story, and he says, well, he should be killed. And he says, that man is you. God has a way of revealing our hypocrisy, our double standards that we have for other people that we don't keep ourselves. But this is really, as we go along, this is what Judah is presenting, and yet it's really hard to judge others when you have nothing to stand on. What happens next? Verse 25, when she was brought forth, she sent to her father-in-law, saying, by the man whose these are, am I with child? And she said, discern, I pray thee, who are these? The signet, the bracelets, and the staff. Whose is it? It's Judah's. All of a sudden, the thing that he thought was hidden, the thing that he thought was taken care of, the thing that he thought was done and away with, all of a sudden comes right before him again. It's time for confrontation. Verse 26, and Judah acknowledged them and said, she hath been more righteous than I. I think that that's an interesting way to depict this entire situation. Does anybody see any righteousness depicted throughout this whole entire story? And what has he acknowledged at this point? He's acknowledged the fact that he's the one who sinned. He's the one that's done wrong. He's the one who's tried to judge. And yet, for the very fact that he was trying to judge, he's come back and said, listen, I can't even say anything. Because that I gave her not to Shelah my son, and he knew her again no more. See, the really interesting part about this very verse here is listen, you go back into ancient Near Eastern customs. I was reading up on some laws that were along the Hittites, what they had, and then the Middle Assyrian laws. They had actually allowed they had a similar law as what God had presented, as far as if a widow, if a woman has lost her husband, she was allowed to go to the brother and to carry on the name and the line. But yet within Assyrian custom and within Hittite custom, along the lines of in that area, you'll actually find that they have made allowances for if there's no brothers, she can actually go to the father-in-law as well. Which actually makes me back up and you say, as crazy as that is everybody in agreement that that's pretty crazy? Okay.
That's not acceptable in our frame of mind. But yet, as crazy as that is acceptable to one who doesn't take God's law seriously, who sees that as a norm, who sees that as acceptable. And so when you jump into this and see what he's relayed here is that she has been more righteous than I, really she hasn't done anything wrong according to their customs. We would see it as sin. But yet if I can relay her and describe her in this way, as an unbeliever, no wonder. It's like, do you ever get mad when people do things that are wrong to you out in the community? Do you ever get mad? Do you ever get upset? They cut you off in the roadway. They're deceptive in their practices as a car salesman. I mean, let's just fill in the blank, okay? All right? You weren't treated fairly, whatever it might be. You get upset, and then you back up and you say, wait a minute. If that's an unsaved individual, that's bound to happen. They aren't going to abide by a moral code that God's presented when they're not a follower after Jesus Christ. And so I could sit here and I could get upset, or I could turn around and present the gospel and hope that they can respond to the gospel, hope that their heart can be changed, hope that they can have a changed life and start living the way that God wants them to live, rather than me sitting as judge over them and saying, how dare you treat me like you do? You get what I'm saying? As you jump into this situation, listen, this is an acceptable response by an unbeliever. This is what they do. This is normal. She just abided by what would have been the laws of the land. And so when he comes back in here and he acknowledges, listen, she's been more right than I have been in this situation. He's just understanding the facts that are right in the playbook. He understands what's going on. But as we go on, we go into verse number 27, and I think this is really the beauty as we finish this out. We finish it, it says, and it came to pass in the time of her travail that, behold, twins were in her womb. And it came to pass when she travailed that one put out his hand, and the midwife took and bound upon his hand a scarlet thread, saying, this came out first. So she's having a child, and one hand makes it out. They put a thread around the hand, but yet he doesn't finish the race. You go into verse 29, and it came to pass as he drew back his hand that, behold, his brother came out, and she said, how hast thou broken forth? This breach be upon thee. Therefore his name was called Pharez. And afterward came out his brother that had the scarlet thread upon his hand, and his name was called Zerah. And you say, well, why are they presenting what's happening here, these twins? Well, I think it's very interesting how it's presented, but you understand that in Matthew chapter 1 and verse 3, you see the connection. And Judah begat Pharez and Zerah of Thamar. And Pharez begat Esrom, and Esrom begat Aram. What is this passage relaying to you? It's the lineage of Jesus. And you say, wow, all of that, so what? Here's the outcome. Jesus' family tree is anything but perfect. Have you noticed that? Further on down the line, pastors preached in Ruth not too long ago. She becomes a part of the line here of Jesus, and yet what happened to the beginning of that? Naomi's husband dies. The two sons die. They go on, and there's a kinsman redeemer, and all of this. We find out through the line, it is anything but perfect. And yet, despite it all, God's plan still works. God's plan still works. God's plan works despite selfish and evil sons, despite an ignorant Judah, and a Judah that's full of the lust of the eyes and the lust of the flesh, or even what we would call the disgraceful actions of a desperate widow. We would come in here and say, despite all of the chaos, God still works. And you know what? Later on in Genesis, you're going to find how Judah becomes a changed individual when he starts stepping up for what's right. What happened? God brought him low. God brought him to the end of himself. There is a humiliation factor of understanding that this is where I get me. I need someone greater than me. It's God. And whose plan works better than my plan? It's God's. That's the beauty of all that's being presented here. And as we come back to those lyrics that I wanted to present to you, we're going to close out with this. As I come back to the lyrics that are presented, here's the lyrics of this song, "O come all you unfaithful." It says there, "O come all you unfaithful, come weak and unstable. Come, know you are not alone. O come, barren and waiting ones, weary of praying. Come, see what your God has done. Christ is born. Christ is born. Christ is born for you. O come, bitter and broken. Come with fears unspoken. Come taste of his perfect love. O come, guilty and hiding ones. There's no need to run. See what your God has done. He's the Lamb who was given, slain for our pardon. His promise is peace for those who believe. So come, though you have nothing. Do you get that? Come, though you have nothing. Come, he is the offering. Come, see what your God has done.